The last 6 days feel like the longest 10 years of my life. While most of us have dreaded the change of administrations in the United States, many held out hope since the election last November that the new president was posturing, and that once in office he would back away from his most outlandish ideas, even if he continued with his ridiculous rhetoric. After all, we survived his first term in the White House, at least those who lived through his mishandling of the pandemic. And while we may have expected that his constant grifting would continue, there was reason to hope that the institutions of government would provide some measure of stability, even as the White House itself returned to chaos. This time, the president arrived in office ready to wreak havoc from day one. After more than 2 months of mischief, during which he attempted to conduct a parallel foreign policy to that of the outgoing administration, he assumed office ready to begin dismantling the institutions of government. While avoiding many of the customary routines of the presidential transition, his team had obviously been hard at work in preparing an unprecedented number of executive orders to release all at once, which have already served to destabilize the U.S. government, remove trusted office holders from their positions, and put an end to long-established government programs. It's been dizzying, and it has only just begun. We haven't concluded a full week yet. It is tempting to turn away from what is happening and dismiss it as an American problem, not our concern. But as one of the closest geographic neighbors to the United States, as its leading trading partner, and as a country that has closely integrated its national defense with it, Canadians have reason to be alarmed by nearly every development. Not only has our own societal life been infected by the polarization and degradation of U.S. politics, as its ugliest rhetoric has echoed across the border, but the United States has become a real and present danger to both the economy and the very sovereignty of our own country. We cannot turn away, and we cannot remain silent. While Americans are free to elect those who will govern them, at least they were so far, their domestic politics is not a matter that concerns only them, because their domestic politics spills over to Canada in the form of threatened tariffs that will affect our economy. Their domestic politics spills over into Canada in a form that may serve to justify those who would dismantle our own commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our society. Their domestic politics spills over in more ways than we can imagine. It concerns us too that countless other countries that have counted on the U.S. as an ally over the past century or longer are now similarly threatened. The president's reaction to the plea of the Right Reverend Marianne Buddy, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, reveals the empathy deficit of both the president and his followers. The bishop devoted most of her sermon following the inauguration to the theme of unity, noting that its three foundations were honoring the inherent dignity of every human being, something that should sound familiar to Unitarian Universalists, even if it was an Episcopal priest preaching it. Secondly, honesty in both private conversation and public discourse, which may have seemed like a shot to someone. And finally, humility, Three qualities that might naturally lead those who are given to disrespect, dishonesty, and hubris to feel uncomfortable, perhaps singled out, especially given her specific illustrations, which may have hit rather close to home. It's hard not to feel singled out when you are, in fact, guilty of the very transgressions that a preacher is using to illustrate her points. She ended with a plea, a humble plea to the president to be merciful towards those who fear for their lives because of their identities, those who labor, those who are fleeing persecution in other lands, before closing with a simple prayer. May God grant us all the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, speak the truth in love, and walk humbly with one another and our God for the good of all the people of this nation and the world. Even most decent atheists I know can say that prayer. Alas, the prayer fell on deaf ears. The plea was not heard except as an insult. The president's fragile ego was bruised, and he demanded an apology. And then his followers began to demand apologies on his behalf. And the good bishop said she was not going to apologize. If you have a gospel and you believe in it, you do not apologize for your gospel when you use it to speak the truth to power. I'm with Bishop Buddy. And I feel as if we are all Episcopalians in the aftermath of what she said, of her bold witness, of her courage, but most especially her deep and abiding compassion that led her to stand in front of someone who is arguably the most powerful person on earth and tell him the truth. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, says an old maxim. So it has been natural for some of us to look at historical precedents in an effort to understand what is going on, even if it seems unprecedented to us, to predict where things might be headed, and perhaps to prevent some of the most egregious possibilities. There's another old saying, which dates back to the 15th century, that says, comparisons are odious. In Much Ado About Nothing, Shakespeare subsequently riffed on this saying to proclaim comparisons are odorous, thus adding a stench to the unpleasantness of the original maxim. That may be true, but comparisons are also inevitable. We make them all the time, even though there's always a danger of comparing current events and figures to those of the past. But sometimes comparisons may help us to better understand what is happening, politically, ethically, and even emotionally. And understanding the character of public figures and movements, or their lack of character, is the first step in mitigating their potential for damage. Such comparisons may also give us hope for, like the fiddler in Fiddler on the Roof, after all the horrible leaders of human history, we're still here. We're still having families. We are still enjoying life when we can. We figure out how to move on, no matter what mistakes may be made at the level of government. Many have compared the present situation to the emergence of fascism during the second quarter of the 20th century. And many of those comparisons seem fair to make, even though they may risk paralyzing us in our response. They may also lead us at times to misdiagnose what is happening, which can be problematic in and of itself. We have long known that Donald Trump has a fetish about dictators, and that while woefully ignorant about many things, he seems to have studied their ideologies, their methods, and their behaviors. And while I've sometimes observed that he behaves more like Benito Mussolini than the more notorious fascist leader of the era, he has shown a growing meanness and appetite for revenge that, coupled with his emotional immaturity and uncontrolled narcissism, leaves me to wonder whether I'm underestimating both him and his cult in their capacity for harm. I had considered calling my remarks today "The Decline and Fall of the American Empire," but that title seemed unduly optimistic. However, it's difficult to escape the feeling that the United States is standing on the precipice of an unraveling similar to the erosion of the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in the 1990s. Only in this case, the decline would entail the unraveling of democracy, which lacks the appeal of the end of the Soviet Union, however short-lived democracy proved to be in the Russian Federation that succeeded it. Whatever happens during the coming 4 years, it seems unlikely that the United States will be greater than it was a decade ago. For me, a more compelling comparison can be made to the Roman Emperor Nero. I'll confess that I had momentarily considered making a comparison to Caligula, but there's just something lacking in the current situation with that one. But Nero may be our guy here. He ascended the throne at the age of 17, a perfectly immature monarch who had resisted the education of the philosophers of his era, and he ruled for 13 years. Here are the parallels that I see. He was enthroned by the Praetorian Guard and the Senate, which reminds me of the electoral college system that led to the current era and the ones that preceded it. Nero was a showman by nature. You may not be familiar with the Barnum and Bailey side of Nero, but it actually is one of the factors that led to the apocryphal story about his fiddling while Rome burned, something that most historians agree never happened. But that never stopped Nero from seeking to be an entertainer. It was in his nature. He appeared in public as an actor and poet, as a musician and athlete, showing what he considered to be his great talent for entertaining the folks while scandalizing other aristocrats with his behavior. I could imagine Nero hosting something like, The Apprentice on reality TV and developing a following for his showmanship alone. Nero was a master of distraction, hence the fiddling story and others. He managed to distract people, in his case with that age-old distraction of politicians, war, and with countless other ways by focusing on the salacious details of other public figures in order to discredit them, mocking others, which kind of echoes with the current situation, mocking them, both their abilities and their disabilities, and doing so with impunity. Now, we have to admit it was easier for Nero because he was an absolute monarch. And as a consequence, he had the authority of the existing order to push back anyone who found him to be distasteful. And yet, despite being an aristocrat himself, the adopted son of the Emperor Claudius, which is how he came to power in the first place, Despite being a child of privilege who wanted for absolutely nothing that society had to offer in his era, these antics made him popular with the lower classes of Rome. And so the very people who came to be most oppressed by the demands of Nero's palace, in fact, were the people who supported him most strongly. He sought to rid himself of restraining influences and engaged in power struggles, most notably with his own mother, whose murder he orchestrated while keeping his own hands clean. Nero never did his own dirty work. Instead, he behaved as a modern-day mob boss, letting others do his work. He was tyrannical, self-indulgent, morally depraved, and often motivated by cruelty. He exploited the great fire of Rome, seemingly to clear land for a new golden house. The color chills me. A sort of Roman Mar-a-Lago. And then he persecuted the Christians as scapegoats for the damage. This was Nero. And it echoes so much with the modern situation that I sometimes feel like we could simply take biographies of this Roman emperor, take a little whiteout, and change the name for the current situation. It also has the advantage, compared to more recent comparisons, of being more in the distant past, which may make it a little less threatening, a little less subject to people quarreling about the comparison, and more importantly, a little hopeful, because nearly 2,000 years later, we're still here. Eventually declared a public enemy and sentenced to death, he died by his own hand at the age of 30. But even then, he maintained a cult-like following among the common people, many of whom expected him to return following his death, and at least 3 leaders of uprisings in Rome professed to be the reborn Nero. Nearly 2,000 years later, though, the world still turns. Empires, both political and economic, still rise and fall, and the generations of humanity unfold as they did before. In other words, there is hope, despite the current, hopefully momentary, unpleasantness. When viewed in the context of history, both ancient Rome, from ancient Greece through Rome and on to the present day, our present day political conflicts are actually not all that remarkable. The philosopher Plato saw a cycle or a sequence of monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and dictatorship, usually in that order, though not always. And we can see his hypothesis repeated again and again throughout history, depending on how we may interpret each term. When liberty exceeds intelligence, it begets chaos, declared historian Will Durant, which then begets dictatorship. He was explaining how Plato's sequence unfolds, since it seems counterintuitive. According to Durant, the primary purpose of governance is to establish order, a limitation on freedom that avoids chaos and allows freedom to flourish. And he conceded that some form of monarchy seemed to be a natural form of governance throughout history, particularly when the monarch was benevolent and created the maximum space for that freedom to flourish. But he argued that overall monarchy has a middling record, and especially when accompanied by heredity, which made it vulnerable to stupidity, nepotism, irresponsibility, and extravagance. But most governments, he said, have involved some form of oligarchy, including those we think of as aristocracies and democracies. Democracy is the most difficult of all forms of government, maintained Durant, since it requires the widest spread of intelligence, and we forgot to make ourselves intelligent when we made ourselves sovereign. Education has spread, but intelligence is perpetually hindered. A cynic remarked that you mustn't enthrone ignorance just because there is so much of it. However, ignorance is not long enthroned, for it lends itself to manipulation from the forces that mold public opinion. It may be true, as Lincoln supposed, that you can't fool all of the people all of the time, but you can fool enough of them to rule a large country. Will Durant argued that the conditions which enabled America's democratic institutions in its early years began to erode through urbanization and industrialization, both of which served to displace people from places of security. It dismantled the natural equality that existed in a predominantly rural society, where land was readily available and most families lived in what we call isolated sovereignty, growing their own food, hunting their own meat, weaving their own clothing, raising their own children. As a consequence, democracy evolved in an increasingly aristocratic direction, which is not entirely undemocratic if those in office are fit for service and somehow accountable to an educated and engaged citizenry. We must find a way, said Durant, of stealing the theoretical virtue of aristocracy, the restriction of office to those who are fitted for it by lifelong preparation, and inserting it into the principle of democracy, that every man and woman should have an equal chance to rise to the top. Let us redefine democracy then, not as the equal right of all to hold office, but as the equal right of all to make themselves fit to hold office. The problem we are facing today is the number of unfit individuals who will be part of this new administration, such as the Secretary of Defense, who is a singularly unqualified man to hold such an office with a deplorable record of moral misconduct. And yet he will head what is essentially the largest company in the United States, the defense establishment. But he's unfit. Or just imagine Robert F. Kennedy Jr., such a delusional man being responsible for Americans' health care. From cabinet post to cabinet post to cabinet post, an administration of the unfit has taken office. What we are seeing in America is the logical absurdity of the assertion that in that country anyone can grow up to be president. What we've all learned is that anyone can become president without growing up at all, without an ounce of emotional maturity or real character, as long as they have the money and the media coverage and charisma, yes, even weird charisma, to contend for office. The funny thing about Will Durant is that he was writing in the 1950s when he warned about what he saw coming in America. But he noted that the democracies of the world had defended themselves with courage and energy against the assaults of dictatorship. They had not yet yielded to dictatorship at home. But they were vulnerable, he said. In particular, he said, if race or class war divides us into hostile camps, changing political argument into blind hate, one side or another may overturn the hustings with the rule of the sword. If our economy of freedom fails to distribute wealth as ably as it has created it, the road to dictatorship will be open to anyone who can persuasively promise security to all, and a martial government, under whatever charming phrases, will engulf the democratic world. Durant described the present moment, where race and class, and I would end gender, have served to divide American society, and where the economy has failed to distribute wealth fairly, but rather has a distribution of wealth that roughly corresponds to France on the eve of the French Revolution. It is a perilous time, and yet we have an ideal. One of the 4 presidents I worked for at the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend Dr. John Burens, not long after he came to office, said that the mission of Unitarian Universalism was to provide spiritual resources for democratic living. When I heard those words back in the 1990s, I immediately latched onto them. I didn't forget our lofty statement of principles or the statement of principles that existed before that set of principles. Nor today would I forget the statement of values that now describes the Unitarian Universalist Association. But boy, when it comes to mission, John Buren's words really resonate with me. The mission of Unitarian Universalism is to provide spiritual resources for democratic living. It echoes the words of Frederick May Elliott, who spoke about the democratic ideal on the eve of the Second World War, who noted that it was inadequate and half-developed, our democracy, but it still had within it the matchless energy of what he called the divine will, or what I might call the nature of things. He noted that democracy suffers reverses, and that it may be betrayed by the half-hearted allegiance of timid souls, that we may need to learn how to adjust to new situations, that we would be forever fighting against powers and principalities that would seek to undermine democratic life, but that we could fight back against it with our moral suasion, with the way we simply live in the world, with the way that we gather as spiritual communities. And so our coming challenge, our challenge over the next 6 months, our challenge over the next 4 years, our challenge for the long haul is to be a community that gathers together to provide spiritual resources for democratic living, so that in the end, the democratic ideal will continue to prevail, no matter who occupies the White House, no matter who moves into 24 Sussex Drive, and no matter who seeks to control the media to manipulate our feelings and our votes. Please join in the closing hymn, number 119, Once to Every Soul and Nation.